been diagnosed with anxiety. In this video, I want to explain to you why anxiety is not a disorder and what you can actually do about it. Hi, my name is John Hawkins Jr. I'm a licensed psychotherapist and trauma specialist and co-founder of Hawkins Counseling Center. Anxiety disorders are probably one of the largest reasons people seek psychotherapy. But when people tend to come to see someone like myself or a physician, with all due respect, it is a bit of a pet peeve of mine when my clients come to me and tell me they've been diagnosed with anxiety. And then they're just given either medication or some coping strategies to manage their anxiety. So in my view, anxiety is not a disorder per se, but it's a symptom of things that are disordered. Each one can be identified and resolved, no matter how many times you've sought treatment for your anxiety or different approaches. I am telling you, none of my clients live with chronic anxiety. Once you understand the nervous system, biology, neurobiology, neuroscience, and understand where these symptoms come from, then you can identify them and adequately address them, rather than just putting it as this kind of catch-all diagnosis that anxiety is a disorder. So what we're really talking about here is chronic anxiety. Because anxiety is a typical response to many of life's stressors. You know, let's say you've got a speech to give in front of people, so you're a little anxious, or you're asking a member of the opposite sex out on a date, or you're struggling with financial fears, or going through a divorce, or you're afraid of getting judged. These are all normal human experiences. So what we're talking about again is when the chronic nature of the person's anxiety exists. So chronic anxiety, for the most part, stems from overactivation of your sympathetic nervous system. So you have what's called your autonomic nervous system, or kind of like automatic, think of that. So you don't have to give a lot of thought to this, or conscious control, things like heartbeat, respiration, things like that, like energy to address a situation, to calm down afterwards. You may need to use more like intentional things to do that. But within the autonomic nervous system, you have two branches. So you have the sympathetic, which takes energy up, and the parasympathetic, which brings energy down. So I always remember that in grad school, like a parachute, bringing things down. So your sympathetic is great for performance, gets you focused, gets you excited. If it starts going higher, then you start getting into a fight or flight response, which if the circumstances necessitate it, that's great. A lot of times what happens is you're stuck in that kind of response, and then it's not necessary for the circumstances you're in. You can't calm yourself down, or it's stuck there chronically. So this is what we're talking about when in therapy we call it like chronic hyperarousal or hypervigilance. So that can stem from multiple things. So one thing I try to be really sensitive to as a psychotherapist is nothing explains everything. So when you go to see somebody, and I can be guilty of this as well, you see through the lens of what they do. So if you go see a psychiatrist, they're probably going to give you medication. If you see a hypnotherapist, they're probably going to do hypnosis with you. So I try to look at it and say, okay, the majority of my clients, which maybe that's a skewed sample size, the chronic hypervigilance or chronic anxiety or the sympathetic activation tends to come from stored trauma in their body. But anxiety symptoms can come from multiple things. So you want to be comprehensive and look at all areas and see the results you're getting. So one of the places that can come from is hormonal imbalances. So many clients, could have like a thyroid hormone imbalance, or cortisol, excess cortisol flow in their system all the time, or a depletion of cortisol. In complex post-traumatic stress, you would think somebody who's got a lot of this like hypervigilant anxiety chronically would have high cortisol, but they're actually depleted in cortisol. So then you get these wired and tired symptoms. You're exhausted, but you can't relax. Another area that can lead to contribution of anxiety type systems is gut issues. So there's a lot of research, and more people are familiar about the microbiome or the gut brain. Probably over 90% of your serotonin research shows is manufactured in your stomach, over 50% of your dopamine. So if there's gut issues, digestive issues, there's a likelihood that maybe you're not getting adequate serotonin generated and getting up to the brain, which serotonin is one of our neurotransmitters that produces feelings of calmness or well-being, things like that. So if you're depleted in serotonin, that's probably going to also contribute to anxiety symptoms. The other area, which again is probably 90% of what I see, and we look at those other areas as well, is through unprocessed trauma, implicit memories. I won't get totally into that topic because I do a whole other videos on that because it's such a crucial topic that is contributing to everything that people come to see me for. But you have two types of memories as human beings. So you have explicit or conscious memory, and that's stored in the part of the brain called the hippocampus. And so that's things like images, facts, words, numbers, any kind of data you're storing into your long-term system for retrieval. Then you have implicit memory, which is stored in the amygdala, which is also the brain's threat detector. So this type of memory has no sense of time, no images, no conscious thought, no capacity to differentiate people, place, or setting. So what I'll see with my clients is that their frozen implicit memories in the body will just trigger off any association, whether you're conscious of it or not. Could be, again, smells, time of day, sound, a phrase of speech, anything will then activate that in the body and then lead to defensive responses of either fight, flight, or freeze, or if the person's fortunate enough, they can still connect and reach for attachment. So that is what's causing it in most of the cases I work with, this chronic activation of your sympathetic nervous system. So if you're in an environment growing up, like in your developmental years, where you have to be very vigilant to what's going on around me, maybe having a parent with explosive rage, maybe a substance user, shamer, they can be neglectful. So I have to get really adept at managing their moods and seeing what's going on, which is in therapy what we call a protective part of the personality that develops. So they're, in that case, scanning the environment, or some clients, maybe you can relate to this, have that waiting for the shoe to drop. They'll start to make progress, get somewhere positive, and then they'll disclose to me that I'm just chronically hypervigilant, just kind of like waiting for this thing to drop. So in that kind of case, first I'll explore the fear of that part of the person. What would happen if the shoe dropped? What would happen if, my spouse or my kids pulled away from me or got angry at me? And you just keep following it out till there's nowhere left to go. And then what? And then what? And then what? So the difference is between intermediate fears and core fears. So an intermediate fear would be, I'm afraid of my partner leaving me, or I'm afraid of getting fired. Okay, and then what would happen? And if you keep following that out, eventually you're probably going to end up at a place where you either fear being trapped and helpless, alone and isolated, or feeling inadequate or not good enough in some way. And so then there's ways to really get in touch with those parts of us that are carrying that wound and heal it through a process called memory reconsolidation. So it's a very neuroscience-based thing that's at the heart of healing, particularly in psychotherapy. So you have to activate the old, and then you have to either release and clear that energy from the body or have a corrective experience. So let's say if I'm in a group session with people and somebody got shamed and rejected by peers and others growing up. So part of them is waiting for that rejection, waiting so that maybe that part causes them to avoid and not share, stay back, and they're like chronically anxious in social settings. And through the support of the group, they take the risk to share something vulnerable, and instead of the group judging them, the group receives them with compassion and empathy, and then that kind of shocks their system where they have a different experience than what wounded them. So there's a lot of ways to then start to heal these wounded parts of us. But for me, like I was saying, that I would say is the bulk of it, but you can have other things like vitamin, mineral deficiencies, genetic abnormalities, the hormone imbalances, the gut problems. So you want to look at all these type of things, and then also taking care of yourself, having a well-balanced system with nutrition, developing better social supports, coping mechanisms, dealing with stress, spirituality, whatever resource you use raises your capacity to handle the stressors of life and some of the things that you may have to face on a day-to-day basis that right now are kind of challenging for your emotional regulation abilities will be higher when you're taking better care of your system and your health. In the interim, some of these things, like in the case of trauma, they take some time to work through. So, kind of dovetailing off of what I just said about the holistic, health and wellness things, there are many, nutritional supplements, things like that aren't just like taking vitamins, but actually will help very much with your anxiety. And so these are things like GABA, which is an amino acid that converts to the neurotransmitter GABA. Taurine converts to GABA as well. So GABA is our main brake in the brain. It's slow, what they call your inhibitory neurotransmitter. So that's the main neurotransmitter that calms things down. So most people who've lived with chronic anxiety are GABA depleted, serotonin depleted. When I used to do neurotransmitter testing, almost everybody across the board who had issues or symptom profiles like that were always low in GABA and serotonin. So then you can't dietarily keep up with the demand on your system. So neurotransmitters come from amino acids in the proteins we eat. And so you couldn't probably eat enough, solid foods or chicken or beef to get your GABA levels high enough to then counteract that. So GABA, I'm a big advocate of CBD. Prefer to take in the tincture oils versus like smoking. Respiration is negatively affected no matter what type of smoking you're doing. Ashwagandha is another good one. Theanine, you can do some research on that. There's just a lot of great options. If your level of anxiety is so acute and severe, then I would say at that point there is, like a appropriate use of medications. I never want any client, even though I prefer holistic options, if possible, to ever feel shame about taking a medication. So I know the majority of my clients will come in, they don't want to be on medications, they don't want me to advocate medications, they want to get off of them if they're on them. A lot of times they're feeling a lot of shame about that, so I really encourage them not to feel shame about that. We can work with their prescribing physician to develop a plan, process, the underlying trauma or emotional wounds that they're still carrying and struggling with, and then working collaboratively with them to develop a plan, maybe eventually to taper off the medication. So if you're out there and you have to take medications right now, most time people are given things like benzodiazepines, which would include Xanax, Clonazepam, Ativan, things like that, where you can't get stable enough to even do therapy or cope day to day. But with the looking at it towards eventually, I would like to be off these medications because, like I said, there's nobody that needs to be on those medications long term. They're just not getting the right identification of the cause of their symptoms and then getting that sufficiently addressed. And I know for some clients, they are on the opposite end where they just want to take the medication. They don't want to do the hard work of therapy. They don't want to address these things. And I have no judgment for that. I get it. I've avoided things in my history that I don't want to deal with. But I would highly encourage you, if you fall in that category, that it's just going to be an infinite road where I've got to keep taking these medications. Another medication that can be beneficial for anxiety potentially and trauma is classification of drugs known as SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So these would be things like Prozac, Zoloft, Lexapro, Paxil. A lot of my clients have benefited on that. Again, talk to your physician or psychiatrist if you feel like that would be an appropriate fit for you. So if you've made it this far into the video, one of the things I really want you to walk away from is the concept that anxiety is not a disease or disorder. What happens to me is there's research around that is when you believe something is a disease or disorder, you feel helpless and powerless against it, that you're just going to have to live with this, that's your fate. And I'm telling you that is not the case. I wish I could line up thousands of clients behind me who've resolved their chronic anxiety that would testify to the fact that, like, I didn't believe John at first, but I knew he believed it. So I was interested and curious about where he was going to go with all this, that you can resolve this stuff. You're not just stuck, doomed. Because I've also seen many of my clients who got stuck on, the brain is constantly adapting and trying to develop a balance. So when you take a medication, it's going to try to counteract that as well at some point. And so then some of those medications don't work as well anymore. I have to keep taking higher and higher doses. Xanax is a good example. I'll get clients who've they're coming in off such high doses of Xanax that they would like to get off of, because those dosages, they can start negatively affecting sleep. They can cause permanent impairment of memory, focus, cognitive capacities, and for the most part, I've rarely met a client who told me their psychiatrist or physician explained all the side effects, explained the warnings of long-term use. And again, we're talking about long-term use versus short-term and acute things. So if somebody goes in and they're having severe panic attacks and they go to the ER, they're likely going to give you Ativan, which is a benzodiazepine. Completely appropriate, completely necessary, because you've got to get stabilized. But that is not the long-term solution. Again, maybe you've fallen into that category, and I'm telling you, there is hope for you to taper off those medications appropriately with the support of your physician and working with somebody like myself. It could be a trauma expert, a psychotherapist, developing more capacities to regulate your emotions, to have healthy connections. And one of the things that, has really come out in the last 20 years or so is research around the vagal nerve. So that can activate in a couple different ways, but it's the nerve associated with secure attachment. So if it activates one way, it'll really shut down your sympathetic nervous system. Also contribute to releasing endorphins, serotonin, oxytocin, really feelings of being bonded, connected, safe, and cared for. And I'm telling you, I've seen that brings people's anxiety down more than medications or anything else. So walk, back through those if you get a chance to watch this video again, and just hit those things of areas to assess for yourself, or at least to start thinking about, or to get support assessing some of those things. But I really want you to walk away not seeing anxiety as some disorder, disease that I'm just afflicted with, that I just have, because it's so not the case. If you would like to watch more about implicit memories or complex PTSD, check out some of my other videos. If you want to know more about the video today when I talked about, feel free to reach me anytime at hawkinscounselingcenter.com, and I'd be more than happy to answer any questions you have, or schedule a time to sit down with you.